today's webinar on student flowcharts. These student flowcharts will provide you the opportunity to evaluate and potentially adjust the process by which students receive services. Developing a student flowchart will serve as a tool to show the entry points and bundling opportunities, so potential areas where students can be referred between services, and might also show staff overlap, which could provide another opportunity for bundling. These student flowcharts will serve as an opportunity for you to evaluate potential areas where you can reach a lot of students, and perhaps considering it as a way to evaluate where the watering holes are on your campus. Today's webinar is largely going to focus on how student flows were leveraged in the BACC initiative. But before we go ahead and get started, I'm just going to go over the webinar technology briefly. You should see the control panel pictured on your screen. If you don't, it's because you've minimized the control panel, so you'll want to pull it back out using the grab tab pictured in letter B on the slide. You should also be able to see an attendee list. If you cannot hear me, please raise your hand. You can raise your hand using the little hand icon. Great, it seems like everyone can hear me. If you have any questions or at any point cannot hear me or any of the panelists on today's webinar, please either raise your hand or ask a question in the question pane. We will hold all questions until the Q&A section at the end, but if you're having problems with the audio, please feel free to ask at any point during the webinar. I will be monitoring the questions pane throughout today's call. I'm going to take a moment to introduce the HED staff on today's call. We have myself, Eva Sashildnik, Assistant Director of Programs, and Julian Haynes, Associate Director of Programs. Also on today's call are our two webinar panelists. First, we have Amy Ellen Duke-Benfield. She's a Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Law and Social Policy. And we also have Maryann Haytmanek, the New Choices Project Director at Northampton Community College. They will both be discussing with you today how student flow charts were leveraged in the BACC initiative. So I'm going to start off by giving the floor away to Amy Ellen.
Thank you, Alyssa. And I'm delighted to be on a panel today with Maryann. Obviously, as she is the college representative from our project, she'll talk much more about how the rubber hits the road. But briefly, I want to give you an introduction to the Benefits Access for College Completion initiative and then how we used student flows. BACC was an initiative geared toward increasing access to public benefits for community college students. The initiative sought to challenge, support, and learn from the ability of community college sites, state community college systems, and state government agencies to develop and institutionalize scalable and sustainable organizational and funding policies and practices that help a diverse population of eligible students gain access to an array of public benefits. So connecting more students with public benefits with the hope that has positive impact on college persistence and completion. The initiative goals were to provide new avenues of helping low-income students succeed in post-secondary education and training and complete credentials, ultimately improving their job prospects, examining the feasibility of using benefits and financial aid to meet the financial need of students, and reducing poverty because more students are receiving benefits and financial aid. Supporting colleges develop sustainable models that build benefit access into the everyday activities across the college. BACC was a partnership between CLASP, the American Association of Community Colleges, and 5 foundations, and 7 community colleges, including Northampton Community College, participated. So how were colleges, next slide please, how are colleges helping students access public benefits? There are 6 to 7 different activities that colleges can take on as a means of helping students access public benefits, and they go from low touch to more high touch. As you can see, you can inform students about the existence of programs, so that would be something that you might do through student success courses. Help students understand to apply, so sort of unpack that process for them and provide the means by which they can take the next step. screen students to determine if they're eligible and assist them in applying. So that's a little bit heavier touch right there. You're actually sitting down with the student, showing them how to complete the application, answering any questions that they have, reminding them about any forms they might have forgotten, etc. Assisting students to provide needed documentation and understand any barriers to eligibility. So there's some of a translation role as well. Follow up with benefits programs and local offices to troubleshoot on behalf of individual students. Unfortunately, the applications that folks turn in for public benefits, just like financial aid, sometimes have errors on them, and it's beneficial to build a relationship with the local office to be able to find out what kind of errors might have taken place on these applications, and then to advocate for policy changes that streamline benefits received for students. Next slide. BACC college strategy highlights, and I'm going pretty briefly over this. I think at some point we might have another webinar where we'll get into much more detail about what the benefits access activities were that these colleges undertook. But for the purposes of talking about the student flows, I just want to flag a few things. The colleges had to develop a process for engaging students that included, 1, reaching out to students in multiple ways, 2, setting up places to apply depending on student needs, helping students apply and submit documentation, and providing follow-up assistance to ensure students receive benefits. And so when you think about reaching out to students, it could be through resource fairs, email blasts, mailing, mass text, using social media like Facebook posts, on applying through self-service kiosks and one-on-one assistance, helping students apply and submit documentation. Some colleges are using college workers to help with that, as well as their own staff. Next slide, please. So in BACC, we introduced this notion of student flows probably about a year into the project. One thing that WFSN colleges have the benefit from is BACC colleges doing everything a couple years in advance, and so learning what worked, what didn't work, and what should best be employed to help ensure that you all succeed in what you're doing. And student flows were something that we decided to have the colleges take a crack at. In BACC, students took several steps from learning about benefits to receiving benefits. Each one of these is a step or part of a process that needs to be clearly delineated. So every step needs to be documented. Developing a student flow allows you to visually depict the process. And you may have multiple processes depending on the 6 different activities that you're focusing on. And obviously, if you're bundling a couple of those, then that process may be melded together. But by visually depicting the process, you can look at as it's meant to work. These are the clear consecutive steps that a student takes through this process, by which a student will eventually receive workforce development, receive financial literacy training, be connected to applying for public benefits. And in this model, everyone knows what his or her role is because it's sketched out on a piece of paper. The student comes into the office, who do they talk to at the front desk? What kind of information is exchanged in that conversation? Then next step, the student sits down with an actual financial counselor. What information is delivered at that time? What obligations does the student have to have their own materials, that kind of thing? If they forget their materials, what's the process for reminding them to bring their materials into a follow-up meeting? What's the process of reminding students of follow-up appointments? So you have to unpack the entire process in great detail to have a better understanding of what your actual process is, and then that also allows you to look at why it isn't working. Where are the breakdowns or lost points of students? In this case, you could see, you look at your process flow, your student flow, I use those pretty interchangeably, and see that students are dropping off in that process of returning back with some of the important documents they need to submit to apply for public benefits. What are you doing to help ensure that the students bring those, turn those forms in? Do you give them a sheet of paper when they meet with you in person the first time? Do you send them a reminder email? Do you send them a reminder text? What are the different processes that you take on in order to help that student reach each step down the process line? What it also does is highlights any lack of clarity about individual roles in the student flow. So let's say you have getting students through the doors are dependent upon faculty telling students about your services. If you're noticing that there are no services being provided to students who say they've been referred to by faculty, then you can see that that's a loss point of students. And go back to your faculty and find out, are they telling students? What's the message that they're telling the students? And then try to repair that loss point. It also, by having a student flow, it also helps you set goals for each one of those areas. If you can almost think about some of these services that you're providing as a funnel, and you're going to be delivering, I like to use the college success course as an example with the benefits access information, because that's going to hit a broad, large number of students, I would imagine. And then the next point that the student will act on is whether or not they come in to work on the kiosk, or they follow up and set up an appointment with a benefits access specialist or something along those lines. And so each one of these points, then once they set up that appointment, then showing up for the appointment, once they show up for the appointment, getting their paperwork in, once they get their paperwork in, actually applying for public benefits, each of those are individual steps that everyone needs to be clear on your team what their individual roles are. And then you also have steps that are relate to your outside partners, for instance, the community organizations that might be providing some services for you as well, or the county benefits agency. Depending on what the tasks are that they're doing part of the process, you will want to include them in what you eventually sketch out in your student flow to make it clear what their role is, what steps they have to take to help connect more of your students to connect to public benefits. We also found that student flows were really helpful when there were staff changes on the college campuses, because a counselor could come in then and see, oh, this is my responsibility as in part of this process flow for students being connected to public benefits. Here's how I fit in, and here's what I do to make sure that this succeeds. So with that in mind, I just want to turn it over to Maryann at this point, who will talk about each step in the process as you document who is doing what, for instance, a referral to an office, and then tracing that flow all the way through and seeing the dropout points that you can then revise the process to make it more impactful. Maryann?
Is my sound on? Am I good?
It is now.
Okay, all right, thank you. I think I pushed a button that I didn't mean to push. Thanks, Maryann, and thanks to all of you for inviting us to participate in this, and I'm happy to see that so many folks are involved in this. You can go to the first slide there for me. I thought that I would first give you an overview of how we got into this process, and we were one of the 7 schools that were involved in the Benefits Access Project, and we also talk a little bit about some of the challenges we faced and then what we learned from it, and we sort of, especially about benefits access, but also what we learned about creating this process and helping us to understand not only how it helped us do our program better, but how we were able to do this better on campus. And at the end, I'm going to share with you a really good success that happened as a result of this. And then, you know, any thoughts or suggestions that that I might have that might be helpful, and certainly accept any questions and take any questions from anybody. So you go to that first slide, the next slide. I thought I'd start with a really, really poor design example. And if you go to that slide, the next slide, as you can see, this kind of looks like a jumble, and where you see up there where it's called the phone call to cohort flow. One of the very first things we did was created a list, a cohort of students that we thought would be the students who would be eligible for benefits. And in your cases, because I know you're looking at those 3 points of the stool, this kind of idea might be helpful to bundle some of those. But as you can see here, there's really no rhyme or reason to this. The colors don't really match. That last yellow one, which is the last one, but you also might wonder about that one at the bottom, which has no connector lines to it. Really, this is kind of where we started. I might have exaggerated a little, like I think there was something in every single box that we did, but this is kind of where we started. You can see that it's not even readable on a PowerPoint. The writing is too small. The yeses and the no boxes really are not consistent. The ones that are the if, go there don't really make any sense. So I thought, I could reassure you that when we started, this is where we were. So there's hope if this is kind of a challenge for you. So if you go to the next one, we're going to give you some examples of getting started. So right from there, it really, for us, and I can't say that this is necessarily the right way, I don't know that there is a right way, but what worked for us was really to start at what was our final goal. What is it that we were trying to present the flow towards? And again, that first one was, well, we wanted to cooperate and do the phone call to the cohort flow, and what we thought was, okay, if we can get better at this, we would start with the process of applying for public benefits, which are in our school. What we were trying to do was teach our staff first, the benefits access staff, then move on to the financial aid staff. That made sense because they were already talking about student funding, the admissions staff, the counseling staff, the advising staff, and ultimately we even expanded it to the career services staff. So, but again, the first idea was we wanted to be able to explain to people in a relatively simple way how to apply for benefits. So that was our final goal. So you could almost start with that at your bottom or your right-hand side. Where do we start? Again, because we were doing this in several different departments, we knew that we were going to have to do several different flows, which would show how you might, in your case, bundle that, how in our case we might use the exact example of a flow, but it would read differently in each department, and you'll see when you see the flow, the eventual flows that we developed, they do look a little bit different in each department. That's because the conversations are a little bit different. So we looked at our final goal first, then we looked at where is it we want to start, where is it that I want to finish, does my original goal make sense, and then what is the best way to navigate from A to B. And remembering that each individual for us, in each individual department, the navigation is going to be just a little bit slightly different. So the next slide is the start of creating a benefits access interview flow. So we're calling this the benefits access interview, starting with our staff. So if you go to the next one, this is kind of what it looked like. And this, if you go back one, please, Elise. If you go back one, thanks. This really actually was our third or fourth step, because what it started was the 3 members of our staff who were going to be responsible for developing this flow, for the actual interview. And what was interesting, and it may have been kismet and just lucky in our case, but for instance, one of the things that happened was the 3 people who were on our staff were a person who knew a lot about benefits, that was me, a person who knew a lot about the college, that was me, a person who knew a lot about flows, because he had done that in his job. He worked for Verizon and did a lot of that kind of work in staffing and in human resources, so he knew a lot about that, not too much about benefits. And then third person on our staff was someone who knew a little bit about the college because she went here. She also worked here for a year or so before she went off to get her bachelor's degree, and she also was a recipient of public benefits at one point in her life. So we had a nice combination of folks who kind of had something, each had something to offer. So really what we did was we sat down in a room and we started talking about, okay, how do we get there? What makes sense? We started with, again, what you'll see there's my handwriting, and this is probably pretty much what it exactly looked like. What is it we want to accomplish? We want to accomplish having students receive benefits. So at the very bottom there you see it says benefits, yes, that's what we wanted to accomplish. What we wanted to start with was, how do students find us? And we had done a lot of work with educating faculty, educating staff, and we're expecting that they would make the referrals. So you can see across the top there, we had counseling referrals, we had financial aid referrals, and we had faculty and staff referrals. Again, referring to us to conduct the screening interview. We wanted them to know enough that they could at least either do the screening themselves or at least talk to the student or potential student about what was it that would help them in a financial situation beyond financial aid, beyond the standard financial aid, what would help them. So that got us to the point where we would get people to refer to us to conduct that screening interview. And then there are several responses to that. One is you yes to the screening, which means you're probably eligible. No, well, then you're probably not going to apply. Another possibility would be it looks like you might be eligible, but maybe not, so that requires a different action that you might take. So you can see at that one, it looks kind of messy. It kind of looks like it doesn't really make any sense. There's a couple of arrows that connect the topics, but not a whole lot of them. So then as we begin then to the next step, and if you go to the next slide. Can you go to the next slide, Elise, please? There you go. That's exactly the same piece of paper, but now it has the boxes around it that show at the top the referral points. Makes a little more sense when they have a box around them and they show the arrow to what's the next thing that's going to happen. And then, and because it was just a piece of paper, I couldn't get sort of clear boxes and clear arrows. But then we were able to connect them, put them onto a piece of newsprint so that we could then work from there. If we wanted to change anything, we could cross it off, we could start a new space. I found it easier to do this. Other people might find it easier to go right into a PowerPoint or a Word, but for me, I found it easier to write it out first. And actually, I'll just do a little commercial there. You can see in the back one of our SNAP posters that we put up around campus, that one's one of my favorites. But anyway, so you can see here our flow, and then if you go to the next slide, that's what it actually ended up looking like. So it has a much nicer flow. We added some things. We added some more referral points. But again, the interview process remained the same. The likely to be eligible, the may be eligible, the not eligible. You can see now it makes a lot more sense. And now when we go to train staff, because we went in and we trained counseling staff, and we trained financial aid staff, and we trained admission staff on how actually to conduct these interviews. So this is a way for them to go back. They have one sheet of paper they can look at. There is a tutorial in Pennsylvania. There is a tutorial on the online application. Our online application for benefits is called Compass. There is a tutorial, but it's probably 30 minutes long. It goes into a lot of detail. And in this case, someone can look at one page and see that it's not quite so daunting. But again, this is just the flow of trying to get somebody benefits and what the process is going to be like, even down to the ones in yellow there are the ones, that's where the student has a responsibility. That's the student has to return the documentation. That's a reminder to the student to bring in their documents if they haven't done it. So those are the things that for us worked. We put our own spin on either the colors or the star at the end. I noticed that was the same with the Working Families Network, and that was totally unintentional. That's kind of how we did it. So those are the processes. Even down on the right-hand side, you'll see the appeal. And where it's denied, that would be the final thing. The student isn't going to get any benefits. And, but then we have another process that we would take students through to maybe help them either get some college resources or get some community resources. But again, we can show this to a staff member who might actually be doing a screening, or at least so they understand if they're explaining to a student, they don't have to make it like it's such so incomprehensible. So that's one of the ways that we were able to put the flow together for that particular process. And if you have any questions, please, write them down, let me know later. But if you move to the next slide, Elise, this is what we broke it down to. It basically has three major parts. It has where are you going to begin. It has the actions that you're going to take as a result of that. The connectors, which show the direction in which the action is going. You can add as many as you want. This is a very simple, very basic flow that we use as our basis for creating any of our other flows. From the action, there's going to be a decision point. So, and again, it may get more complicated than that, but I was simply trying to make a sense that it went from here's where we start. And when Maryann was talking about, you might also look for the points where your people are dropping off. So one of the things that you might find is that students aren't bringing in their documentation, or you might find that a faculty member makes a referral but the student never comes. Well, that gives you an idea of a way that you might be able to have a simple thing like the faculty member walk them over or send you an email so that you can get the student's permission so you can follow up with them so you don't lose people that way. And those are the kinds of things that you can find in the flows. then the decision points that happen as a result of the actions, they may simply come as a result of the action, but they may be interconnected. So you might have two decision points that either depend on each other or flow back and forth between each other. And I think as you try doing some of these, and part of my advice to you is really start with something small. You know, you're going to start with something that makes sense to you, that you already know how to do, that, you know, that isn't going to be an overwhelming task. And then it takes you to the results or the outcome. You want it to be simple. That was what was really nice about having Rachel on our team, because she knew nothing about flows. She didn't, you know, she was new to this process. It was her first professional job. And so for her, it was good to kind of, for John and I to run that by her to say, Rachel, this, you know, between our experience with benefits and with doing process flows, does this make sense to you? Will this work for you? So that was actually very good to have her input. The three of us were just a very good team to work on that. So if you go to the next one, I'm just going to give you some examples of the flows that we developed. This was the flow that we developed for our career services. And something that we found to be really important. Now, I've been a member of the career services staff for a long time, but even then, even though I pretty much know what goes on in the career services office, I made sure that I sat down with the director of career services and I said to her, this is how I think it flows. You know, these are the reasons that I think people come into the career services office. And she actually, you know, helped me out to add some things that I had forgotten, because I'm not part of the everyday staff. I'm kind of on another floor. I don't necessarily, up until then, I wasn't always participating in their staff meetings. So that was something that we found, actually, that finding out that I wasn't attending staff meetings was a good point for us to realize, a way for us to keep them involved in knowing what was going on. So what I did was sat down, you know, where do they get referred? You can see there many career services students are self-referred, and these are the things that they might be coming to the career services office to find out. We also added to this one, you'll see the red triangles. That's where we decided it would be helpful for staff to understand these are the points where you could have that discussion about the student's finances. And it was really very interesting to us in the beginning to find out that staff actually was reluctant to talk to students about their finances. Even the financial aid staff, which was odd to me, but we found that they were a little bit reluctant to go beyond what was on the financial aid forms. And that was a real eye-opener for us, and that was why we decided that we would develop a flow as part of that that would show, okay, so if the student comes in for a job search, and you can see that's the second action down from the referral, and there is one of the red triangles. If a student's talking about a job search, well, obviously, an obvious thing to talk about is how much money do you need either to be in school, to stay in school, to pay your bills, do you have children, you know, are you a single parent, do you get your child support? And that was, again, a real eye-opener for us about the kinds of conversations that were so natural to us that weren't happening in the career services office, in the admissions office, in the financial aid office, even in the counseling office. So as we developed that, we made some suggestions along those points, which also then helped maybe with the drop-off points, because if you're talking to the student about how this is going to make a difference in their life, how it's going to help them stay in school, that's a natural reason then for the student to consider applying for benefits. So again, in the career services flow, you can see where the places are. If you're talking about changing your career goals, another time to talk about it. You don't want to encourage a student necessarily to get training for a job where they're not going to be able to live, or if they are going to have a lower salary, like something like childcare, maybe you want to talk to them about, you understand that might still make you eligible for something like SNAP unless you have another source of income. So you can see for our career services flow, that gave us the opportunity to talk about some of those things. That's a generic career services flow. If you go to the next one, Elise, it's in for our advising staff. This one was about a specific process. It's how to enroll at Northampton Community College. One of the, the generic one sort of gives you the overall view. This was very, very specific. It's how do you, when you're sitting with a student and helping that student enroll at the college, these are the 5 steps that they're going to need to take. Again, we began to look at where are the points where you could have the discussion about public benefits, remembering that they've already seen the flow about how to do the interviewing, whether it's referring or whether it's they're going to do it themselves. But this gives them an idea of, oh, at the orientation we can do an overview and we can talk about it just as another kind of financial aid. When talking about a student's short and long-term financial needs, can be part of the career decision, can be part of enrolling, because you're going to be talking about financial aid most likely, and you see that moves to the paying for college. And then every single one of the discussions around paying for college has to do with whether or not you might be eligible for benefits. And again, in Pennsylvania, just quickly, like why that would appeal to someone who's only applying for SNAP. In Pennsylvania, if you're getting SNAP and you're going to college, you might also be eligible for help with transportation money. You might also be eligible for help paying for your books. So it's a very important conversation to have, because we all know the cost of college textbooks. Many of us have multiple campuses, so you might have students traveling to different campuses that are 20, 30, 40 miles apart. That transportation piece might be very, very important to them. So again, we began to look at, for us it was important to be able to help the staff understand these are the points where you can have the conversations about public benefits. It also allowed us to see where we were losing the students, whether it was once you had the conversation and they didn't bring in their documents, or maybe it was if somebody just didn't call them and remind them that they had an appointment. We used a student worker to do that. So that was kind of the way we addressed some of that. And then if we go to the next one, which talks about some of the challenges that we had for us, and I think I had a conversation with someone in our grants office, actually our director of grants one day, and she said to me, but Maryann, how do you know if you're going to get there if you don't do a process flow for it? And I said, well, I sort of took pride in the fact that I'm so much more intuitive than that, but what I realized was that didn't help her because she's not intuitive. And so that was sort of what made me think about how to figure this out, how to explain it, not just to the people who it comes to naturally, that the flow comes to naturally, but explaining to the folks who maybe are more intuitive, who maybe aren't so data-driven, to help them to figure it out. Because what I would always say was, if I could figure it out, you could figure it out. And again, that process of just sitting down in a room and working it out, sharing it with people who are going to be using it, does it make sense to them? Because it doesn't make sense to have a process flow that looks really pretty but doesn't work for the people who are going to be using it. Again, we also learned on focusing on one topic, because public benefits is such an array of benefits, because it creates so many issues. You could literally do a flow for each of those things, but when we stood with one topic and staying on track, and we kind of almost appointed someone to sort of say to us, we're getting off track, we have to get back to where we belong now, and maybe asking the same question again and again. And again, that's what I learned from the grants office person who said, no, Maryann, that's not what you want to know, this is what you want to know. Remember, this is what you want to know. And that was really helpful for us, us folks who kind of just do it. What we learned was there is a process to it, there is a step-by-step to it, much like Amy Yellen described, and that for us was a process learning that. And so, and by becoming proficient at that, we discovered that it was much easier than, my apologies, that was a reminder for me, it was much easier to explain it to other people as well. It became very much a rote decision, so that then everybody was hearing the same thing, which was important to explain to. So for instance, the financial aid staff, they needed to hear it a little bit differently than the counseling staff. And that led right into helping staff understand the value of doing something like this, not only doing the benefits access work, but also creating a flow so that they could understand what they were doing. And we got some feedback from them that was actually a very good piece of information. And just on last Friday, as a matter of fact, at a student affairs meeting, the director of athletics said, it would be really helpful to me if I knew the process in each department, because I don't always know what's going on in every department. So I was able to raise my hand and say, I've already started that process. I did it about student flow for benefits access, but we can certainly adapt that for your understanding and your need to understand what goes on in each department. So that was a real, that added some value for each department to know what is going on and how they can use this for their own purposes and why it's valuable to them. So if we go to the next slide. What it was helpful for in benefits access, and I have to say I do need to give credit to Amy Ellen and Abby Newcomer when she was still here. One of our very first convening meetings was the one where we began to talk about the process and where we were losing students. And we really, sat in, just like we recreated here at Northampton, we sat in a room, hammered out what the flow looked like, and then began to identify where were the places where we were losing students. What that helped us to understand was we can do this for each of the things that we do, whether it's doing outreach, whether it's conducting the interview, whether it's training the staff, whether it's helping students figure out the flow. So we understood that once we had the basics, that, that 1, 2, 3, 4, we could do it. And then it can be adapted for any process that we needed to. And then that simple flow, once you establish it, sort of lets you go, and John used to call it this sort of 1.0, 1.2, 1.3, and sort of an example of some of the ones that you saw earlier. So for instance, the general advising flow that we did for the advisors could then be used to 1.2, which would be how to enroll at Northampton. 1.3 might be withdrawing from classes at Northampton. 1.35 might be changing your major. So within one department, you could have different levels of flow so that people could understand what is, again, the process from A to B. How might you combine those that you could see, like admissions and financial aid? The process might be very similar, and even in our new student enrollment center, I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do is make that flow work together so that an admissions person or a financial aid person could welcome a student and know which way to send them based on what their need is. So all of those flows were helpful in helping us to put all that together. And some suggestions, the next slide. Keep it as simple as you can. You can embellish on it once you have your simple flow begun. And always keep in mind your goal. And I think back to Ann saying to Ann Taylor, who's our grants person, saying to me, Maryann, remember, you can only do it if you know what you want to get. It's sort of that, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. And that bad design, that very first one, that's kind of what that was. It is so important to get input from other people. Again, because I knew Ann was really good at it, the first ones I tried, I ran them by her just to make sure they made sense to her, and then I got input. We all got input from the different departments that we were working with, and then checked back with them, okay, this is what we've come up with now. Did we get it right this time? Well, you need to tweak it a little bit. Then we would take it back and try again. So you always want to make sure that the folks who are going to be using this information understand this information and had input into it, and that, again, they understand the value of it. And then you got to be willing to edit it and change it. Again, today, or right before I came to this webinar, we were talking about how the changes in our Student Enrollment Center have created some issues that we didn't anticipate. So now we'll go back to the beginning and we say, okay, this is the flow that we anticipated. What is it that now it should look like, or what will be more efficient? So that's kind of my advice. That's kind of where we came from. If you look at the one last slide, which is consider the impact of the flow, again, on the people who will be using it. And I also found just some online practical assistance. When I first started doing these kinds of flows, I didn't know there was a difference between, a rectangle and an oval and a square and a sideways diamond, and, there apparently are, and I know that, you can attribute to those symbols whatever you wish, but I just put one of the websites that I used when I was first learning how to do this, and they're pretty simple, and it's just a Microsoft program, and I think I just Googled creating process flows and came up with this, and it's actually a pretty good one. So I found that to be helpful. And one other thing that I don't have up there that occurred to me actually just right before we got started, practice on something simple, something that you know how to do, that you're very familiar with, and then, practice going towards your goal and checking it back with someone who's maybe familiar with the process. So yes, it makes sense to them, and I think then you can become more proficient at it. So I appreciate your listening. Thank you so much, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Maryann and Amy Ellen. As Maryann said, we'd like to take questions now. So as you should remember, there are 2 different ways you can ask questions. You can either raise your hand and we can unmute your line and you can talk to the whole group. Or if you feel more comfortable, you can type in a question in the question pane, enter it, and then I will read it out loud to the group and we can respond. So the first question we have is, I think either Maryann or Amy Ellen can answer, is who would you suggest comprise a team working on these student flows?
Maryann, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think obviously it has to be the people who are going to be impacted by it have to have some input, whether it's one person representing a department. So when we use those different departments where we did the flows, we generally had the director of admissions, the director of career services, the director of advising, and then someone who has the knowledge, is knowledgeable about the topic and about what it is you're trying to achieve in order to get the best product, because you want to make sure that you're not forgetting something, and somebody who will kind of remind you that we have to stay on task here. It's so easy to get off task when you're doing this, we found. But we had a taskmaster who helped us to stay on track.
Great, thank you. Did you ever at any point consider engaging students in this process, or do you think that there would be value in doing that?
Absolutely, I think there would be. We did this at the very beginning of the process. So we didn't at that point, but one of the things actually that I'm doing now is I'm working with our business club to get some input from them. So, and we've met twice now.
Great, thank you.
They're going to help us develop some marketing materials.
Thank you. Our next question is, keeping in mind that staff buy-in can be a challenge, how would you suggest a college approach, pushback if they were trying to perhaps change the process, that do any process changes that could result from the student flow development?
Can I take a shot at this, Amy Ellen, and then maybe you can?
Yeah, I was going to say the person from the college should go first.
Yeah, I will tell you that it was initially, what we heard most often was, we don't have time to do this. It's great stuff, but I look at that and I say, I just don't have time to add that to the stuff that I'm already doing. And that's where we began to try to make it as easy as we could for people. And we found that's why the triangles that we ended up using to say this is where you can have that conversation. What we found was we spent a fair amount of time, maybe the first semester doing this project, really just educating people about poverty and about the numbers of our students who really had very little financial resources. And we actually found some champions among the faculty, a couple of really good champions among the faculty who, and in our first 6 or 8 months, I would say most of our referrals came from faculty. So if you could find somebody who's a champion, whether it's a faculty member, it might be somebody in financial aid, it might be, absolutely get a champion at the top levels. If you can get your president, that's the best, but somebody who will talk about it and mention it regularly. But for us, it was finding a champion. It was making it as easy as possible for folks to understand. Once they got that, if students got, even if all they got was $100 in SNAP, once faculty and staff understood that, they began to realize, oh, this isn't that bad. And, I don't really have to do much except send them to Maryann's office or John's office, or once we got the counselors involved or the financial aid folks involved, they began to realize it wasn't really any different than sending a student for help with a resume or help with tutoring, or if it was a student with a disability. But that was a process of educating them first. And we had designed it that way, I think, wisely, but I don't know that was all that deliberate. It was just that made sense to us, but it was helpful once we found, again, some champions who said, oh, my student can't get to class. If we can get him a gas card, or we can get him some money to get food stamps where they can afford to buy gas, that would be great. Then they don't have to miss their next 2 tests. Literally, we had people say that to us.
Maryann, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Maryann nailed it.
Great. Just
and I think all the schools experience that.
Yeah, it's not unusual, and I would not be surprised if all of you don't experience that. I would actually be shocked.
Right.
Because even the schools, it appeared like everyone had bought on in the planning period. When it came time to really change processes, there were some growing pains around that,
Yeah.
There was a lot more at stake then because they had money and they were trying to make process changes. But I think it's important to lay out, what Maryann's talking about is that culture change, and that's part 3 of your implementation plan that I think it's definitely worth thinking about, because that has implications for, the equity agenda and the culture change have definite implications for how willing people are going to be to change their existing process, the way they do their job right now, and how open they're going to be to making a change that may only take 30 seconds,
right, or
it may take 5 minutes, or some who will be open, and we saw this at colleges, people were happy to spend an extra half hour with a student if the student needed it. But it's needing to gauge where that willingness is, and then once you have some folks who are on board, and Maryann alluded toward this, make them your champions and have them be ambassadors to the other faculty, the other staff, other folks in the counseling department who might be resistant, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, Maryann. That's a great point.
And you definitely, one thing I would say, you don't want to draw student flow for someone that entails them doing the work without them being in the room and part of that discussion, right, because that did happen in a couple of BACC colleges that I won't name. But everyone had their good team put together with the Dean of Student Services and Dean of Academic Affairs and a couple other folks, and they went ahead and started changing the student flow and people's job processes without including them in that initial discussion. And I think that's a real warning to all of you, to include as many stakeholders in the process as you can along this planning process.
That's true.
Thank you.
If I could just add one thing to that, we found, one of our champions was we hired a new dean of students in the middle of the process who was all on board with it. She really gets it, and she just decided whenever she hired new staff, she would just make it part of their job. So that was easy, but it wasn't easy getting the folks who. Because she would hire people who wanted to do that. But it wasn't so easy getting the folks who felt that it was adding more work to them.
Thank you. So along those somewhat similar lines, for BACC colleges that perhaps struggled with this process and weren't as successful as Northampton, what do you think were the pitfalls that they had, or obviously aside from not having broad engagement in this process?
Maryann, you might have to answer. I mean, we had good experiences with it, so I don't know that we were just lucky. We had good experience, so I'm not sure what the other schools experienced.
Yeah, people had pretty good experiences with it. I think where it was challenging was the level of detail down to which people were willing to or felt like it was worth getting down to. I don't know if you want to ask your question in a little bit different way, because I'm not sure that I get it.
I just think the question was more of what, for colleges who maybe went through this similar process as Northampton, what other additional challenges might you add that maybe Maryann didn't touch on?
Yeah, I think, like I said, the level of detail down to which you get, and people are maybe saying, oh, this feels like busy work, but actually it's really important to break each of these out into some degree of detail so that everyone's clear on what their task is, what role they play, and then it also allows you the chance to see where your loss points are. At every decision point, what decision that student is making and what information do they have at their disposal that's contributing to them making those decisions. So that's one thing that schools did spend more time on than I think that they originally thought. There's, some people did student flows at the really 30,000-foot level, and to be frank, they weren't very helpful for them in terms of actually changing processes, because there wasn't enough detail in there for anyone to hang their hat on, for anyone to say, oh, I see myself in there, in that flow. Here's my role in the process. Here are the 3 things that I do. And here are the 3 things that the person after me is doing. And so those sorts of things, I think it's easy for folks to fall into the trap of not being detailed enough initially.
Great, thank you. Are there any more questions from colleges? Again, you can raise your hand or you can submit it through the questions pane. I guess just one last question before we wrap up the webinar is, Amy Ellen, for you, what kind of technical assistance were BACC colleges provided around this work?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, you broke up a little.
Oh, sorry. What kind of technical assistance were the BACC colleges provided around this work?
Sure. We actually had separate meetings set up with each college. I think the idea was initially we had a discussion about it on a webinar kind of like this, or a conference call kind of like this, and then folks went back and started to try to flesh out their student flow, and that's when we got all different levels, 30,000 foot to down to 10,000 or 5,000 foot, which I feel is much more impactful. And then had individual calls with each of the colleges where we went through each of the steps of the student flow. And the amount of time that took depended on all the different players who were involved. For Northampton, they had involved the financial aid office, admissions, and counseling. And so those were 3 separate flows that we went through. And then we could have educated discussion once. The other big benefit and power of these flows, I think, is once you're up and running, then you can actually attach numbers to each one of these processes and dissect where things are failing, where you have loss points. And so that sort of TA then continued every month along the course of the college. But in terms of getting the actual student flows up and running, that was something that we did individually, on a one-by-one basis with the colleges, since each of the colleges that we were engaged with had a different, no one was using the exact same model, which I think is probably similar in your case as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I just have one question for the colleges on the call today. If you could just please raise your hand if you have a draft of any of your student flows, or if you started working on this piece of the implementation plan, it would just be helpful for us to know. And you can just raise your hand. It should be in the pull-out pane for the webinar. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So I just want to, again, thank Amy, Ellen, and Maryann for joining us on today's webinar. If you have any questions for them, you can feel free to email me at the WFSN@achievingthedream.org email, and I can connect you to any of them if you have follow-up questions. As always, I will be placing this recording on our YouTube channel and distributing the recording and the PowerPoint to all colleges likely tomorrow. So thank you again for joining us on today's webinar, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you all. Best of luck. Thanks.
Thank you.